Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our final work session regarding the fiscal year 19 through 2028 capital improvement plan. First, let me just recognize how many members of our staff, including our senior staff, are with us today. We really appreciate you all making the time to be with us to answer final questions as the board prepares for action on Saturday. We know you have many other demands on your time, and we're glad that you're with us. We have a report from our Fiscal Affairs Advisory Commission today with which we'll start. We thank them for their work and their analysis of the CIP, and I believe they have some recommendations for us. After we hear from the FAC, we have two objectives today, which is to surface, to the extent we can, any remaining questions, to the extent that we can get them answered, all the better. And if there are final ones on which we need information that staff needs a little more time to provide us, today is our last opportunity to do that. I would also like us to fulfill the objective of discussing, in particular, any changes to funding levels in this CIP that board members would like to advance on Saturday when we take adoption action. By surfacing that today, getting a sense of the board about whether individual ideas are supported by a majority of the board, that will enable our county manager and our Department of Management and Finance to bring us a version of the CIP for action with updated tables, charts, and numbers so we can actually finalize on Saturday. Today is also an opportunity for board members to begin advancing and surfacing any proposed guidance to accompany the CIP, although the standard of finalization is a little bit lower for that if any of that guidance doesn't have implications for the funding levels. So that is what we are here to do and hope to achieve in the next couple hours. And we will begin with the Fiscal Affairs Advisory Commission. We're very lucky to have the chair, Tenley Peterson, with us. So Ms. Peterson, over to you.
Thank you, Chair Crystal and board members Dorsey, Garvey, Gotchal, and Weisstadt. My name is Tenley Peterson, and I'm the chair of the Fiscal Affairs Advisory Commission. This report was written by myself, Jillian Burgess, Paul Holland, and Peter Robertson. Thank you very much to the county manager and to staff for meeting with us to discuss the CIP. Overall, the FAC commends the county manager and staff for developing a comprehensive and responsive proposed CIP that covers FY19 to 28. We recognize that the proposed CIP is built around complicated circumstances and some conservative fiscal assumptions, and we believe that the staff have developed a proposed CIP that addresses these difficult circumstances and allows the county to retain its excellent credit rating. The CIP areas that we focused on include the public schools CIP impact, neighborhood conservation, and the fiscal policies debt ratio. The first FAC recommendation, which is the overall recommendation, the FAC supports the proposed level of funding for the FY19 to 2028 CIP. 10 were in support, 1 no, and 0 abstentions. Now looking at Arlington Public Schools, we primarily wanted to focus on looking at continued collaboration between county staff and the Arlington Public School staff being essential to ensuring this significant investment is done in a fiscally responsible manner. Our recommendation is the FAC recommends that the CIP accommodate anticipated future school enrollment growth while also exercising fiscal responsibility. All 11 of the members were in support of this. We wanted to make sure that projects are constructed in a fiscally responsible manner within a reasonable scope and budget to meet the high-level instruction standards of APS. And we want to make sure that Arlington County and APS are working together to ensure that the cost per seat is restrained and that county land and resources are used more efficiently and cost-effectively. Looking at the second area of neighborhood conservation, we have our recommendation. The FAC recommends that the county board support the county manager's proposed reduction in neighborhood conservation funding. All 11 members were in support of this. We encourage county staff to prioritize must-have projects that impact safety, security, and equity with the funds. Regarding the debt service ratio, our recommendation is the FAC recommends that the county board instruct the county manager to review and report on ongoing efforts related to ensuring the county stays within the 10% debt service ratio and protects the county's bond rating. 9 supported this, 0 no's, 2 abstentions. The abstaining members agreed that we should stay within the 10% debt service ratio, but felt that with our county's reserves that we were sufficiently able to protect our AAA rating. But 9 were supportive of the resolution overall. FAC recommendation number 5, FAC recommends that the county board re-examine the proposed costs for Ginny Dean Park, $18 million, and Rosalind Highlands Park, $9.8 million, to see if these costs are excessive. All 11 were in support of this. We noted that recent park projects have cost the county far fewer tax dollars. For example, the Rocky Run Park was $3 million. We understand there may be some other circumstances that warrant the costs being at this level, but they did seem exceptionally high for park projects. And the FAC is concerned about the fiscal impacts of contentious and protracted public processes, including those that resulted in the anticipated capital expenditures at Ginny Dean and Roslyn Highlands parks. Public processes have critical impact on capital investments, and stronger public processes will result in improved capital investment decisions. Now, turning towards future considerations, we do have a lot of these, so I'll just go through them quickly. Anticipated toll revenue allocations, we wanted to make sure that when we're looking at anticipated toll revenue from I-66 and I-395, you're seeking the county's, the community's input, in particular from commissions and committees on that. Looking at land acquisition funding, we want to make sure that we are, with the updates to the public spaces master plan, we are going to be able to take advantage of upcoming and strategic opportunities to expand the county's land inventory. And so we just want to make sure that we are able to be nimble and able to acquire properties if that's the most strategic decision for the county. Looking at stormwater management, we want to make sure that the county is able to pursue an assessment of stormwater management infrastructure now and look at new innovative ways to fund improvements. There was some flooding in Waverly Hills that we noted, and we just want to make sure we're being proactive in that area. But more generally, we want to make sure that we're looking at expensive federal stormwater mandates that are coming down the pike and be sure that we're able to meet those mandates when they come online. Looking at project construction timelines and delivery schedules, we want to make sure we're diligently monitoring construction timelines to avoid cost overages. On the topic of maintenance, FAC has long time advocated for maintaining what we have, and the CIP does maintain this, does prioritize this approach, which will avoid unnecessary expenses in out years. However, we did have concern for the condition of the north side salt facility and how its status may impact salt delivery and safety if there are some winter events this upcoming winter. As far as the level of flexibility with CIP, the FAC recommends that county look into how our neighbors do capital improvements planning. There is a sense that some neighboring jurisdictions are less specific in their capital planning and therefore remain more nimble when unexpected needs arise. On to construction costs. FAC is concerned about possible increases in construction costs due to tariffs on building materials, and we advise decision makers to remain flexible and creative. On the topic of accessibility, the proposed CIP slows bus stop accessibility improvements, so we want to ensure that there are acceptable transit alternatives for those impacted by this decision. And finally, on the topic of funding options, developing a capital budget in tough budget years requires difficult choices. These choices may sometimes result in actions that would not otherwise be taken. There can be temptations, for example, to fund operations out of funds that are typically used for capital funding. Such decisions may be appropriate in the short term, but should be reviewed as budget conditions change to ensure that long-term adverse consequences are avoided. Thank you very much. Please let me know if I can answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Let me provide an opportunity actually for questions of our Fiscal Affairs Advisory Commission. Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, and Ms. Peterson, again, commendation to the FAC for the thorough analysis and really appreciate the recommendations. I'm curious about recommendation number 4, which the abstaining members, as you testified, believe that our reserves are sufficient enough, presumably, to deal with any adverse view of our hitting close to that 10% by the bond ratings agencies. Can you tell me a little bit more about what informed that recommendation? My understanding has always been that Arlington was fairly aggressive in its reserve policy, translated to mean we're not actually carrying the level of reserves that ideally bond ratings agencies would like to see, but due to our other best practices, we're allowed to carry lower levels of reserve. So tell me more.
So we have actually had presentations on reserves from county staff, including Steve Agostini, and I'd say the feeling of the commission overall is that we have an appropriate level of reserves. We do have our 2 members who felt like we've got this money and we don't need to be as conservative as we are being, but that was not the view of the overall commission, who has had presentations from staff.
So it was less of an analysis, but more of a...
A gut check, yeah.
Thanks.
Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So one thing that kind of struck me in reviewing your letter is that there appeared to be more consensus and unity on most of these questions than there was during the operating budget discussion, which I'm not sure what to chalk that up to. Maybe the skill of the manager, I don't know. But thanks for the report. So I do have a couple of questions, not on your specific recommendations, but future considerations, which I always find very valuable in any of your reports, Ms. Peterson. So two things: level of flexibility with the CIP. You recommend that county staff look into how our neighbors do capital improvements. There's some sense that some neighboring jurisdictions are less specific, thereby allowing them to be more nimble when unexpected needs arise. Is this grounded in any particular examples, number one? And number two, to the manager, what's your reaction to that?
This was something that was raised at one of our previous meetings, maybe in May, and something that we had talked to staff about. And I can go back to the members and get some specific examples, but we thought that if we're less specific, that gives us the opportunity to not disappoint communities that may have been expecting a new park or a new project that, down the line, we may not want to make that decision for various new budget conditions. So if we're less specific and say, we have money that will be going to fund parks, and at the moment when we need to spend the money, we'll kind of do an assessment about what the best park to invest in, rather than saying, in 10 years, we're going to fund a specific park project.
Okay. On the other hand, there's something also to be said for predictability and certainty as well. Mr. Manager?
So I think you've both highlighted the tension between the predictability and the flexibility. I would note that our CIP, until 8 years ago, I think was a 6-year CIP, and we moved to a 10-year CIP very intentionally so that we would not necessarily be very prescriptive about the costs that are happening later on in that CIP, but offer more of a sense to the community what some of the choices are. And I'm going to say this, I say this all the time, which is that the only thing that you're absolutely setting in concrete is the referendum totals. Everything else is flexible, and we build in that flexibility. And I've been very clear that we're hoping that 2 years from now there's additional flexibility. So I appreciate the sentiment, and I think it's something that we all struggle with all the time. I'm not going to have anything more profound than that at the moment.
Okay, that's fine. And it's certainly true that every 2 years we see some projects come in, some projects drop off. My last question is just in terms of funding options, Ms. Peterson. I'm sorry, Ms. Garvey, did you have a point on this? I'd be happy to yield the floor.
I was about to turn out my light. I was going to ask a question about flexibility, but you asked it, so I'm good. Thank you. I'm done.
Oh, okay. So thank you. So funding options, there's always some kind of tension at the margins between whether something goes into the capital, is considered a capital project versus a pay-go or something that you're going to be put in operating. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the recommendation here, there can be temptations, for example, to fund operations out of funds that are typically used for capital funding. Could you just give us a capsule of your general philosophy on this, and whether that definition kind of expands or contracts with the economic circumstances of a given year, or do you feel that we're approaching this from the right amount of either rigidity or flexibility once again in terms of, okay, this is going to be a CIP item versus an operating budget item?
There's a lot packed in there, and I'm reflecting back on what the board did and what I proposed for pay-go funding as part of the fiscal 19 adopted budget. We did show cuts there below previous amounts, but in the paving budget, but which had been picked up as part of the bonding capacity. So I'm always reluctant to, and I think, and I'm trying to remember what year it was, maybe it was fiscal year 2012, where there was essentially a tax increase that was dedicated to making sure that our pay-go investments were at a certain base level. I think you have to be very, very careful about that. The sentence there is warning about something that I take to be a very serious concern, which is that you not sacrifice your state of good repair investments in light of a particular pressure that you face on an annual basis. That's not what we did this year when we cut the paving amount, because we had a backstop for financing out of bonds. But I will tell you that, going forward, if you adopt this CIP as laid out, there are commitments in there starting in fiscal 20 and 21 for PAYGO resources that are a little bit above what we included in the adopted 19 level, that I think will squarely face that challenge when we're looking at the budget next year.
Okay, that's helpful, Mr. Manager. Thanks, Ms. Peterson.
I actually wanted to ask, while we've got Ms. Peterson, were there any particular examples that the members of FAC had in mind in issuing this caution, or was it a sort of broader philosophy you wanted to take the opportunity to underscore?
The specific area that was raised was the C&I revenues for Columbia Pike Enhanced Transit Operations funding.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions. Two comments in addition to my effusive thanks for the work that you all have done. Really appreciated your comment about examining the proposed cost for Jenny Dean Park and Roslyn Highlands Park. And I think actually that's a really helpful exercise to go back to recently completed projects and Rocky Run as an example. I think one of the things that we're struggling with in this CIP, and I think we'll have a little more discussion on it later with staff, is parkland acquisition. And so I see there's a real opportunity as projects get refined in their scope, and perhaps we hope maybe come in at the lower amounts. There'll be potentially, I hope, a natural home for some shifting of that bond capacity or that debt capacity. But really wanted to appreciate your work in pointing that out. And then the only other comment was also resonate with your goal of ensuring that revenue from I-66 tolling comes back to benefit the toll payers, including members of our community. And wanted to suggest that actually that allocation and prioritization is done not by the Arlington County Board, but by the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, on which Mr. Dorsey, Ms. Garvey, and I serve. So to the extent members of the FAC are interested in learning about that prioritization process of the money across the region, I think we would, I know the commission would really benefit from having your insights. So I think any of the three of us, or all three of us, would be delighted to make a connection to some of the staff there, to get members of the FAC, maybe a subgroup that might be interested in this question, learning more and giving us recommendations.
And I would say, as liaison to the FAC, I'd be happy to start that conversation with the commission, so you can understand how it's done right now. Thanks.
And help improve it. Thank you so much. Again, really appreciate your time and your recommendations for us in a challenging year. All right. Well, since the county manager has really assembled all of the august leaders of the county staff, we should probably make it worth their time and ask some questions. So, colleagues, I'm going to throw open the floor rather than try to organize us in any specific topical way. I know there are some, I know. That's right. I'm unleashing the floodgates. I'll sort of just let us begin with any questions we have. I think we'll likely move organically into some guidance and proposals that we all want to make. But for now, let's begin with questions that are remaining. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, I had a question, which I was thinking actually bringing up with Ms. Peterson here. It's on this issue of park acquisition. So if we set aside money for park acquisition, can it be used for a land acquisition for something that's not a park?
So that is very dependent on the wording of the referendum, if that's where the spending authority comes from. And I think that we've gone back and forth over multiple referenda cycles about the wording on the bond referenda to make it either broadly flexible, or if it says specifically for park acquisition, that probably is some sort of a limitation. Though, I mean, questions like that we usually refer to the county attorney and bond counsel specifically. But for other sources of funds, for PAYGO and those kinds of things, there's a lot more flexibility.
Okay. And I think we've had this discussion before, but also, I guess to put it another way, if we think we might want to do park acquisition, but we're wanting to be flexible, and we put it in land acquisition, why would it be preferable to say park acquisition instead of land acquisition, which gives us maximum flexibility for the money? It can be used for parks if needed, but if something else comes along, we can use it that way as well. Is that?
Well, I think that, and I'm going to ask Ms. Cowan if she wants to jump in here and add anything. If you had land acquisition, that would cover the broader category of park acquisition. And so I think that might be, if you wanted the additional flexibility, but at times the board has wanted to make a statement in the past that we're going to, rather than simply acquiring property, for example, like the Buck property, we want to acquire property that is going to be exclusively for park purposes, whether it's recreational or open space, and they've wanted to make that statement specific.
Thank you. And yes, it's really more of a political issue than anything else. And I'll come down where I always have, which is I would like flexibility. Great to use it for parks if that's what we need, but I really like to put as much as possible in land acquisition so we can use it as we need it. That's just my own way of approaching things.
It's a great point, and I think it's also important. One of the biggest challenges I have, at least, is the distinction our manager made at the start, which is we are bounded by what goes on the bond referendum for those 2 years. We are not necessarily bounded by what's in the 10-year CIP. So in the later years, if we want to sort of shift between categories before it goes to the voter, we'll maintain that flexibility. And in fact, we do, right?
Yeah, just to be clear, I like it on the bonding that we're doing right now. I like the flexibility there, and then we can be aspirational out in the future as much as we want. But when it comes to bonding, I like the flexibility. Thanks.
Great point. Other just general remaining questions. Let me go to Mr. Gutschall and then back to Mr. Westhead.
Yeah, we ready to talk about Army, Navy?
Sure.
Access drive, okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I very much appreciate the follow-up from staff on, with respect to a couple of the bicycle improvements, bicycle infrastructure, particularly in the Columbia Pike corridor. And I did have just two, I think, quick follow-up questions. The first had to do with the Army-Navy Country Club, and I guess this is also for my colleagues here to understand, make sure I understand. So the manager has come back and recommended a shift of 105K from improvements outside major corridors and 125K from Walk Arlington in order to enable some preliminary feasibility studies of preliminary design and engineering plans for the project.
Mr. Gutschall, I'm just going to pause briefly. I know our clerk has this language that she can share on the screen too. So to the extent folks, this is the one entitled CIP Amendment Army Navy Country Club Access Road. That might be helpful for those of us who are visual learners as you ask questions.
Right, and so thank you for that. And so my question is this is now part of the staff proposed CIP, or this is an amendment that we would make as a board?
This is an option for us to consider, is that right?
It's an option for you to consider. So I'm viewing my proposed CIP as that document I submitted in May with the one additional change I made during the work sessions, which regarded switching out of funding related to NVTA. So that's my proposal. At this point, you would be making an amendment that would become part of the final product.
Right, and I would just comment, I guess, that I appreciate staff digging deep to come up with a paltry $330,000 or $230,000. However, at least it's getting us somewhere. I mean, I think that I would just really underline that with respect to having, this to me reinforces the notion that we are making very difficult choices between many otherwise very worthwhile opportunities. I do think that this, not only for the purposes of the emergency access road, but really the bicycle and pedestrian connectivity between the 22202 zip code area and really the rest of Arlington, but in particular to the Pike here, I think this is just an extremely important connection. And we know, and this is what is very important to me, that we know that the investments that we make in bicycle infrastructure are, in terms of bang for the buck, are the soundest investments that you can make. And to me, in terms of what we stand to gain here, this is a huge gain ultimately, and we've got to move the ball forward. And hopefully, well, I think the hope here is that we will find in future CIPs that we will have money available then to actually construct it. So the idea of moving the ball forward on the preliminary design, I very much appreciate the effort of staff, and I'm hoping that my colleagues will agree.
Yeah, let me go to Mr. Dorsey, and then I'll get a couple comments myself.
Yeah, since this is a new area, I certainly support this allocation and do appreciate finding the funds. I do want to be very clear, though, because one thing that's been sobering about this CIP process as opposed to others, some in the past may be fairly characterized as sort of like the Christmas tree capital improvement program, where you figure out a way to signal to everyone that you're committed to what they're committed to. And here, while I think there is the commitment to hopefully finding a way, we should in no way assume that one will be forthcoming that is cost-effective, feasible from an engineering design standpoint. We just don't know yet. We hope that this process reveals one that is, but we have to be aware that at some point the news could be returned, which puts us in a difficult, or puts a difficult choice before us, whether or not the cost of doing this is something that we can do, should do, when we should do it. There are all kinds of yet to be seens that we have to realize from this. This is really just a first step, and I'm not trying to be a downer. I just think it's important that we say that with just about everything that we do here.
Mr. Dorsey, I think that's an excellent point. And I think that's absolutely right. The most important thing is that we get this project, or we get this project, the scope of this project, to a point where we can actually have all of those conversations about the feasibility. And I think that's what this money will allow us to do. I think there's some questions remaining about ADA compliance, for example, that could have a dramatic impact on the cost, or the relative lack of cost of this project, right? If there are reasonable alternatives in the corridor and this project does not have to bear the full brunt of ensuring that compliance. The point I would make for this discussion, it's nothing that I would want us to codify in the CIP adoption, but I know our staff has presented us their recommendation that our own legislation adopted, our own resolution adopted on the CNI, the commercial and industrial tax, would preclude using that money for this purpose. I am actually very interested in potentially having that conversation with our business stakeholder community. I think it's premature to have that conversation. I think scoping this out will actually allow us to have a good discussion. I think there is a compelling case to be made that this could be a means of allowing one of our growing population centers, which is residential population centers, which is Columbia Pike, to improve its access to one of our major commercial and office centers of Crystal City. And I actually look forward to the prospect of having a better scope project that we can take to some of our business community stakeholders and have a meaningful conversation about whether that's consistent with the spirit of the CNI tax to improve accessibility and the benefit of the business community. Premature to do that until we have a scope, but I'm not ready to preclude that conversation, and I think having a scope will allow us to do it. So I think this is at least three of us, and I'll give Ms. Garvey and Mr. Weiss an opportunity to weigh in or ask questions such that they have them. But I do think you have a majority, at least of the board at this time, that is interested in pursuing this option that you've prepared for us. So to the extent we want, we're asking the staff to update a version of the CIP, go back and check, make sure the tables all reflect this. I think this is an action we're likely to adopt on Saturday. But before I assume that, Mr. Weisstadt, let me give you an opportunity to.
Sure. Yes, I very much agree that we should move forward and try to accelerate this. Having said that, just remind us for the record that this has to be initiated, or it has to be completed by what year in terms of the originating document?
So that is we included that information in the published proposed CIP. The deed was recorded, or the easement was recorded in 2012, and so we have 30 years to start construction on the facility. Staff did some initial 20 years, excuse me. So it's 2032.
Okay. For the first spade of dirt to be turned, or planning, or true planning initiated.
Construction.
Okay. Okay. But with no outside date for completion.
That's my understanding.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Leach.
Okay, thank you. I have visions of us having a plan and running down there and doing one shovel full of dirt to make sure. But anyway, that aside.
At midnight, right?
Yeah, at midnight. I just wanted to check something, Mr. Leach. I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this question, but when we're working to plan ahead for schools, there's always a worry that, you plan and you do designing, and then if you wait too long to build it, everything's going to change and you're going to want to do things differently. I assume with a project like this, you can do the scoping out and the designing, and it's not likely that things are going to change a whole lot as to what's required, right? So that we can do this and assume that we'd be prepared to go ahead in a year, or in 5 years, or in 10 years. Is that a reasonable assumption?
I'll just make a couple of comments. One, it would require the full cooperation of APS, because any connection back to the neighborhood of Arlington View requires the use of APS land. So that's one thing to know. The second is The topography of this particular connection is extremely challenging, and we looked at it in 2010. Very steep grades, mature woodlands, up against 395. This is a very hard project. And we did some initial feasibility in 2010 as part of the negotiations with Army-Navy Country Club, but we have more work to do. And we, I think, then need to have a community conversation about it because in my own look at this, it is going to be extremely expensive. And I don't think it is the panacea for bike-ped connectivity that we might think, principally because of the topography.
Question, if I can follow up. And are you saying how difficult it would be if it were just purely a bike path or a pedestrian path and we decided for a while not to worry about vehicles on it, but just bikes, cycles?
It was actually negotiated with the country club in 2010 as emergency access, and that was really important.
So it has to be.
It was the police and fire access element that really actually got them on board, with the bike and ped access being permissive.
Thank you. I had forgotten that part. Thank you very much.
Retired military that play on that course.
Yeah, that part I remember. Thank you.
All right, and then I have another.
Please, absolutely.
Thank you. So this was with respect to a question about the bike and pedestrian bridge over 4 Mile Run on the Pike, right near Arlington Mill Community Center, and a request for an effort to look at that. And in the staff response, and I don't know if this is available for staff to put up on the screen or not, the staff response referenced the bridge renovation program and an opportunity perhaps to use this sort of third placeholder in the bridge renovation program in the proposed CIP to look at the Columbia Pike Bridge over 4 Mile Run, and that has an allocation of $2.8 million in FY 25 to 27. So kind of the same question, is this, I wasn't clear from the staff response whether this is part of your proposed CIP or this is an option that's available to the board or something that we would discuss at a future time. So could you just help me get fully up to speed?
This is an option for the board to consider. Staff reviewed the Bike for the Pike petition pretty closely and provided the board with responses for all the items raised. In our review of the CIP as currently constructed, this appears to be in reach and would be a good use of the funds. That bridge is an important connection between the very west end of Columbia Pike, Arlington Mill, and other portions of the Pike. And we've already done some initial staff review.
So is this something that we might expect? I'm a little hesitant, frankly, to jump on this right away. One, it's in later years, 25, 27, so we would have plenty of opportunity to look at it. What I would not want to have happen is for that third placeholder to kind of be filled up without having had this conversation again and looked at this more holistically. So as part of the update of the bike element in the MTP that's forthcoming this year, would that inform this in any way?
Our complement elements and the CIP are very much related. I think the bike element of the MTP that will come before the board, hopefully before the end of the year, will call for more robust network of facilities. And I think this is likely to be in there in some fashion. So
this is likely to be in there. And I actually, Mr. Leach, because that sort of begs the question too on your comment earlier about the Army-Navy connector, if that maybe that's not the panacea for bike-ped connectivity between the two corridors. Are you anticipating that the bicycle element would offer some other solutions?
Right now, that element is still under development, and it really is the facility proposals that are the focus of the work as we go through the summer into the early fall.
Okay.
A little premature, although there is absolute focus on improved bike and pedestrian facilities at the east end of the pike connecting to Joy Street.
Right. So I guess I'll just ask Mr. Manager, this third sort of placeholder of a TBD in the bridge renovation program, that would come back to us anyway if you were going to, whatever that third spot's going to be. So we don't necessarily have to designate that now. We can know that this is a contender and not necessarily have to designate that right now. Is that correct?
Absolutely, correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ritchell. Mr. Vystad.
Thank you. Just two questions. My colleagues and I did have a difference of opinion with respect to the Long Ridge Park Aquatic Center, but one thing that we all did agree on was charging the manager with looking at partnerships and sponsorships for advertising, naming rights, and that type of thing to yield more funds for the Aquatic Center. And I'm wondering, Mr. Manager, if you might be able to give us a short update on that initiative.
So we have, and Eric? We have, and Eric Beach is going to come up here and give us an update on sort of the status of a solicitation we're putting out to get a partner for that process, and because I don't have an update from the last month, so I'll give you the opportunity.
So we're still developing the scope of work based on some previous work that we had done. And so the Department of Parks and Recreation is working on that scope to begin a solicitation process with the Department of Management and Finance. That would be for a municipal marketing firm. And that firm, I know we had some conversation with the board that would cover the plan for how to approach that, the time frame, and then setting sort of the packages of what those values would be, what we could expect out of a sponsorship or a partnership for a naming rights scenario.
And so the timing on that, if I have this right, which is the solicitation will go out and we'll have a firm on board hopefully by the end of the year.
Yes, I would say.
Which will sync up with as construction activity gets underway as soon as this month and plans have been finalized. It makes it easier for us to go to prospective sponsors and say, here's the plan, here's the actual timeline. One of the challenges we found to date was to getting sponsorships was that the process had been a bit inchoate. Is that right way to use the word? Inchoate. Now we're to the extent that we are ever optimistic, we're slightly more optimistic that since there's something real in hand that it will provide us that kind of opportunity. But it's not an area where we have a lot of expertise or experience, so that's the reason why we're going outside to get a marketing firm to help us with that.
So a solicitation for the marketing firm by calendar year end?
Yes, I think that's safe.
Okay. Thank you. My second question has to do with the North Side Salt Dome. So, Mr. Manager, as we know, as we all know, unfortunately, we've been briefed, and that beautiful aging copper green verdigris patina-like patinaed structure is on its last legs, and you've thrown in the towel in terms of salvaging it.
Womp womp.
Say what?
Womp womp.
And so it's due for a temporary replacement and then a permanent replacement. And on page A7 of this proposed CIP, I just want to quote some language here where you say, and this was actually raised by an individual at Open Door Monday last night, who lives just a mile or two up the road from the North Side Salt Dome. And he noticed this language, and it says, and I quote, "It is highly probable that the snow response in North Arlington will be longer due to the loss of this tank. Until the 26th Street North and Old Dominion site planning process with community input is completed, the county does not expect to construct a new storage facility. Negative impacts, while generally limited to the winter months, would be experienced in various locations." So the question really is, what sort of interim measures or mitigants can we take to lessen any impact which you are apparently predicting, at least in the short term, in terms of servicing winter roads in the northern part of the county, and what might be the impact in the south, since that's where our vehicles are going to have to go for the salt, or at least more of the salt.
Yeah, so two things about that. I'm going to let Mike Moon speak to the specifics of it, and if I get this wrong, Mike, you're going to correct me, which is that right now at 26 and Old Dominion, we not only have a salt dome, we also have some salt set aside next to it under a tarp, which provides us a little bit extra capacity, and that might be what's affected if we have to move to a temporary structure, but I'm going to hand that over to Mike.
Yes, members of the board, we do have a temporary stockpile adjacent to the salt dome that's being referenced in this section of the document. There's 1,200 tons there currently. I think a lot of the language here is referencing and speculating on the loss of the structure in total, so you wouldn't have what the capacity is that is in the salt dome, which is 4,500 tons of salt. Currently, we have 2,000 tons in the structure itself. And so, you know, the current state of that is that we can't use that for ongoing operations. So we're currently looking at alternatives, but one of the alternatives, and the one that we're pursuing right now, would at least keep that temporary stockpile in place so that we can continue to service North Arlington. It's not without some challenges, and I think you're going to be briefed very soon on some of those challenges and what's presented. But we're working actively on trying to get a temporary structure that we can utilize through the upcoming snow season to address the concerns. But I think that having that one temporary stockpile there and staying on top of the reordering can allow us a mitigation measure where we can continue to service North Arlington through the winter months.
Okay, and then I guess there will be some increased cost in terms of vehicle flow up and down, back and forth with the trade center?
Yeah, that would only be in the circumstance we have deadhead loss time and inefficiencies that are put in place if we totally lose that salt tank in total. So that's why I'm putting some emphasis on that temporary stockpile that we have where we can operate. If we totally, you are correct, if we totally cannot use any north side facility, then we run into those inefficiencies because we have to trek all the way back down to the trade center.
Okay, but you're not really anticipating any material additional stress on the trade center or the surrounding community as a result of the temporary structure at Old Dominion?
No, we're not. But I think I would put out there to the board, though, there are some challenges with getting some type of temporary structure up, and I think you'll be made more aware of those challenges in short order, but I think we're actively working on a plan that would allow us to continue to service North Arlington and put those facilities in place to where we can continue the level of service we have.
Okay, that's helpful and reassuring, I'm sure, to some. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. So, colleagues, are there any other general questions that have not been answered during our last few weeks of process? If not, I'm going to move us into some proposed guidance, I think, from different members. Okay. Let me actually ask, well, the manager's ear again. Let me ask a question, actually, before I ask Mr. Weistat to maybe begin with a conversation about neighborhood conservation. So there is very little money to be found during the CIP, as we've discovered, with, to my knowledge, only one exception, which is that we recently, our Department of Human Services recently received some notification about the state that there might be money available coming from the State Department of Health and Human Services with regard to a group home, potentially freeing up some bond capacity. Could I ask you to speak to that? Or
yeah, I'm going to actually ask Ms. Cowan to speak to that.
So as DHS has been working with DES on the replacement of that group home, they approached their partners at the state level, the Department of Behavioral Health, and they were able to secure an additional $1 million to help support that group home. Because as you might recall from our work session back in early June, part of the, need from the state level is that they're closing some of the larger centers, yes, exactly, if you will, and asking that those, highly developmentally disabled community members be moved back to their home communities. And so the replacement of that facility will allow us to house those particular community members, in some cases who've been there in that center for 20 to 40 years, to come back to Arlington. And so when they heard of this plan, they were able to provide an additional $1 million in capital funding for use at that site. So we're really thrilled about that. It meets both of our objectives. But then, as you might recall, our CIP had included GeoBank funding for that project, so it frees up $1 million for your.
Fantastic. And that would have been on the bond referendum for November, correct? Yes, okay,
Okay,
great.
yes, I wasn't-
So thank you. So everybody hold that in the back of your head. Let me go to Mr. Weistat with some thoughts about neighborhood conservation to begin.
Sure. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So neighborhood conservation has certainly been a topic of focus in the community and here at 2100 in recent weeks. And so I'd like to ask our clerk to post some draft guidance for our consideration in the context of the CIP. So this language is a little more Spartan than I might like, but I think that it distills the elements of a path forward which hopefully keeps faith with the communities while at the same time acknowledging the reality that the program has some challenges and has had some challenges for quite some time. So I'm not going to read, well, I guess I could go like the Federal Express guy, but I don't know, Ms. Crystal, I'll just kind of highlight a couple of key things. So we're in certainly kind of a short-term funding constraint, and so I feel that this is really the time where we do a little reassessment and review of the program. And that, as we say here, that the NC program would benefit from a thorough assessment and review, including a potential restructuring with a focus on ensuring that necessary community infrastructure be funded and delivered in the most efficient, cost-effective, equitable, and timely manner possible. Accordingly, the County Board directs the County Manager, with the advice and consent of the Board, to develop a charge to and appoint an ad hoc working group no later than September 30th, 2018, in other words, the end of this fiscal year, to perform such assessment and review, including the relationship of the Neighborhood Conservation Program to the Neighborhood Complete Streets Program and other county programs that fund or could fund substantially similar or complementary projects. So we're really looking at this from a holistic, across-the-board, county-wide perspective. This group will return to the manager with findings and recommendations for county manager and our county board action in time to inform the development by the county manager and action by the county board on the fiscal year 2021 operating budget and the next CIP. So in other words, the fiscal years 2021 and 2030 CIP, to 2030 CIP. The manager will appoint a body that ensures that the perspectives of relevant stakeholders and the broader community are represented, provide for an appropriate community engagement process as the working group moves forward, and convene at least one work session with the county board to provide an interim update and check-in. Before I yield the floor, I would just point out that I do believe that the NC program over the years and the NC Commission has done a great deal of good work. In fact, I was just at a ribbon cutting for Oak Grove Park a few weeks ago, actually, and
Oak Grove Park.
2 words, not one. Exactly, Mr. Manager. As well as in my own neighborhood. At the same time, we know that the project selection process has had issues. There's differences of opinion with respect to criteria, whether certain things like public safety, proximity to schools or community institutions should be emphasized, scoping and cost concerns, issues with respect to contractor selection, negotiation, procurement matters, quality control, oversight, timeliness of delivery, and equity in project location. And that is not to say that the Neighborhood Conservation Program has been beset or plagued with these types of issues any more than other community infrastructure. And all we have to do is look at a couple of examples with respect to the the homeless services shelter and the art bus facility on Eads. There are issues whenever the government or even the private sector undertake large capital projects or small. So really this is calculated to get a grip on how we can amend, not end, reform, and potentially recast the program and look for meeting the central goal here of efficiency, cost effectiveness, equitability, and timely delivery of needed projects. Thank you.
Mr. Dorsey, comments, thoughts?
Yeah, I'm prepared to generally support this, although I can't quite associate myself with the extensive supporting commentary from my good colleague, Mr. Weistat. You know, I think what the benefit of this that I see is that we are going to look at this and look at all of the elements that the manager uncovers through the stakeholder engagement process. I think they are going to be different and perhaps less targeted towards problems with the program itself, but a whole host of other issues that I hope that we can comprehensively address. But I do think that this is the right vehicle to do it. And, you know, hopefully over the course of the time that this body is in play, that it will, I love the fact that it will stay within the manager, so it can become something that is more technocratically oriented and, with all due respect, not politically motivated, so that we can actually get to the point where we hopefully have this on a sustainable path, so that we're not trying to deal with these issues every year or so.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, and I think this is the way to go, too. And I look forward to we're going to get it back in details in September and take a look at it. I mean, we've been hearing frustrations from residents. We've been hearing frustrations from people who have projects, who don't have projects, who don't like the projects the way they're going, how much the money is, and sometimes frustrations from staff trying to make it all work. I mean, I think it's basically a good program that's not working so well for anybody right now, and we need to take that time out and fix it. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Mr. Gutschall.
I'll associate myself with sort of the comments already being made and just add that I think we've heard from some of our commissioners on the Neighborhood Conservation Advisory Commission sort of a lamenting that with the cuts to the program that are in fact included in this CIP due to the extreme budget constraints that we have, sort of a worry that we're effectively killing the program with a slow death. And what I'm hoping, because I think that would be an incredible loss to the community. What I'm hoping that by adopting this guidance, what we're doing is we're sending the signal that no, on the contrary, we're not looking for a slow or any kind of death. We are actually looking to take a moment here that's afforded us by the current constraints, but to really hit the reset button and to double down on the program and actually invest the time and the staff resources that will go with this to looking into and crafting, remaking the program in a way that it can serve its original goals, which were to enable neighborhoods to come together and to figure out how to improve the neighborhoods and to be citizen-led and citizen-driven, but do it in a financially responsible and constructive way. So I support the language and thank Mr. Weistat for his stewardship.
So, colleagues, I started this conversation by asking Ms. Cowan to summarize the $1 million of freed up bond money for the South Irving Street project. What I'd like to do is amend this direction to add that $1 million towards the neighborhood conservation program. As Mr. Gutschall suggested, this program is going, I think, from $12 million in the upcoming bond cycle to $4 million, which is really dramatic. And I think we can think about how to do more or the same amount or less with less, but I think a real show of faith will be for us to redirect at least a little bit more money to achieve another project or two. So that would be my proposal. We don't need to formally take a vote on this amendment right now, but I do think in order to ask our staff to go ahead and work that number out over time, if I can just get a sense, any strong objectives. Absolutely. Okay, yeah, please, Mr. Gutschall.
I don't have a strong objection. I have just learned of that $1 million now, and I will tell you that the first thing that popped into my head was land acquisition. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know the right way to work this out, and I'm definitely not going to stand in the way if it's the will, if the others are with you on putting it here. I don't think that this is a bad place to put it, but first in my mind was land acquisition.
Yeah, and keep that in mind too, because I want us to talk about parkland acquisition, or land acquisition generally too. So.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm certainly interested in favorably considering that amendment. Just for the record and to clarify my own understanding. So the manager's proposal in the CIP would provide $2 million annually for neighborhood conservation, and that's on top of roughly $21 million in balances that also include unspent bonds, and that's compared to about $15 million in projects that have been scored. Is this all roughly correct?
Comports roughly with what,
Okay.
and Michelle's going to look and tell you where you were wrong.
Pressure. But generally, you know, beyond just generally confirming that the orders of magnitude are correct, I'm just really curious as to what is the impact on the pipeline moving forward, just granularly. What will this mean?
So the $1 million, if added, would be essentially, and this is a rough order of magnitude, means that there would be one more project that would actually move through. And if I understand what the chair is suggesting, would be involved would be an amendment to the actual referendum language to move $1 million out of one category, which was right now the funds were in community infrastructure, and moving it over to the Parks and Recreation bond item. That would be another $1 million that would be available. So essentially,
Is it Parks and Recreation or is it community conservation?
community conservation, I'm sorry, I have that, yeah. So essentially, the program would have $3 million in its first year and then $2 million in the second year, or I guess the program could decide to split the $5 million up equally, but there would just be an additional $1 million, which would be roughly one project.
Okay. And so so it would add roughly one project, but with the pipeline of already approved but unspent projects, can you just give me a sense of what the project delivery is going to be over the next couple of years? What I'm trying to suss out is really this whole idea of whether we're effectively ending a program or just shifting a priority of focus in awarding new projects versus managing existing levels of projects. So what's the workload going to be for NC in just delivering on the already approved projects to which we have not yet spent funds?
So Tim McIntosh just psychically promised me he would have the answer for you. So go ahead, Tim.
Good afternoon.
Mr. McIntosh.
Hello. You're correct in that it's about $21 million in balances. 15.5 of that is committed to projects that have already been approved by the board. So we have approximately $5.5 million left from our 2016 bond. We had a funding round in June, which totaled about $3 million, which was another couple of projects. So that leaves us with about $2 million left in our 2016 bond, which we'd like to have on hand to take care of any cost overruns that may come up, so we didn't use all of it. The additional $1 million would essentially fund probably another project. If it was a much smaller project, maybe we could break it into two projects, but no more than that.
Thanks, Mr. Rossi, for that clarification. So again, I'll ask staff to bring forward an amended version of the bond referendum as well as the CIP that we can consider. And if there are other things, other proposals we would like staff to bring forward for our consideration in terms of amendments to the bond referendum, we can consider a couple options. I'll just say I'm prepared to support too Mr. Vice-Stat's guidance. You know, I'll just remark, it's interesting. I think we've landed on a solution that is shared across the five of us, but I think the way we define the problem might differ. And I will just say, to sort of stake out my own point of view here, I am a big supporter of this program. I don't think it's broken. I think it has had its challenges. I think it's overcome some of the challenges in recent years. I will tell you, one of the proudest or happiest votes I've had the opportunity to take in my 2.5 years on the board has been we approved the Long Branch Creek Neighborhood Conservation Plan, which is a community that is, I think, something like 75 or 80% renters, incredibly transient. The notion that a program that was created half a century ago to build community in neighborhoods still works for all Arlingtonians from whatever their walks of lives was just a wonderful thing that I think connected our past to our present to our values as a community. And I think whatever challenges we have about funding projects, that is such an important thing that happens throughout Arlington that I'm really interested in seeking to protect. And so funding one more project is not going to make or break whether we can continue to achieve those values. But I think as we ask our Neighborhood Conservation Advisory Commission members, ask our Neighborhood Complete Streets Advisory members, ask our broader community to step up and think about the future of the program, it would signal at least a commitment that even in a difficult funding time, we can continue to make this a priority. So that's sort of how I'm coming to this, but I think, and I really appreciate Mr. Vice-Stat's efforts to ensure this direction is worded broadly enough that we are not baking in any assumptions or descriptions of the problem problem that might not be shared across all 5 board members. There's certainly an opportunity to improve the program. These projects have become really costly for a variety of reasons, and I think the opportunity to maybe try to get back to basics and figure out how to do that, deliver great projects cost effectively, equitably, as the charge suggests, is a real opportunity before us. So thank you. So again, no formal vote on that, but we'll see it come forward on Saturday for action. I think we also have some questions about stormwater management. And I know I and Mr. Kutchell were talking about this earlier today. There's a lot we're still trying to get our head around. To put a finer point on this, we had some folks come, have shared a lot of perspectives via email and communication with the board. We had a lot of folks come to the CIP work session to express concern about flooding recently, particularly in the Waycroft Woodlawn neighborhood, but we know there are a number of hotspots throughout the county. So before we think about any direction, I'm going to ask our very patient stormwater management planning team that has walked us through this before to maybe help at least me understand, and colleagues might have again. And I'm going to try to ask this question in as sort of straightforward and narrowly scoped a way as possible, which is we are trying to find where projects are listed in the CIP, but what I'm really interested in at least is we have some known hotspots for flooding in the county, right? And for reasons that you've shared with us in the past. And so what I am most interested in is what is our plan to tackle those hotspots? Do we have a list of those known areas? I know there is a list of challenged areas. I'm trying to think what it's called in the Stormwater Master Plan. And so whether that is in fact our latest potential flood risk reduction studies. How do we identify likely places for flooding or recurrent flooding? Where are they captured? And what is our process to tackle those different areas of the county? Does that make sense?
That was a multi-part question. I'll try and remember all of it and answer the question. Yes, there are at least 107 key. Oh, I'm sorry, Demetra McBride, the Bureau Chief for the Office of Sustainability and Environmental Management. I'm still trying to form my response. Yes, there are over 107 locations that were identified for capacity issues in the Stormwater Master Plan. Since that time, there have been 20 to 30 target areas that are sensitive and vulnerable to flooding. They are not necessarily in FEMA floodplains. There is, I'm trying to be succinct. The master plan is a conceptual plan. It is based on a number of studies. They identify where these key capacity issues are, and we move forward on a prioritization scale. When you get into the actual engineering, design, topographical, transactional, and other details and studies and assessments with dealing with each of those projects, they sometimes create, not uncommonly, what we call, you encounter barriers to execution. And sometimes the barriers become so significant and so numerous that you fast track those other key projects that you can move forward with the available funding that are also priority projects. And you try to reassess the ones where you do have this pause button that is really occasioned by this collection or this nexus of these barriers. We've run into a couple of key vulnerability areas that do represent an example of this. Sometimes, but not exclusively, there's also an issue of whether or not the scale of the remedy is financially feasible. So you also go back and try to see what other alternative pathways there are that make it a more viable project.
Okay.
And I know I didn't answer all the questions, but pick out which one.
If I could just ask you or Jason to add, so the timeline of when the board adopted the Stormwater Master Plan, I think was 2014?
September of 2014.
Right, and so we continue to do analysis on that because if it's dynamic nature, but that just to give you some context.
So let me try to ask it this way. If a resident lives in a given neighborhood and they would like to know where in the process of prioritization, assessment of the remedy, identification of obstacles, their project is, how do they track that? How do we track that as the board?
Well, residents usually reach out and we enter into really community engagement, and certain communities are much more active in that area, but it's not as though we just take a message and then put it aside or leave it in a place. We're actively involved with those communities.
A dashboard, for example, in any way of saying, here of our, I think you said there was about 20 to 30 spots. Here's how we're moving through them. Here's what the barriers have been identified. I'll see if I can give a little context where I'm asking. My understanding is that we, Arlington County government, changed a little bit how it entered projects into the CIP a couple of CIPs ago. Previously, we used to the CIP might gesture at a set of neighborhood projects, and now we're trying to be a little more holistic and say, that the CIP includes money for feasibility studies, for example. But I think what that has led some folks reasonably to say is, my neighborhood used to have a project in the CIP and it doesn't anymore. And so what I'm looking to say is how can we say, here's how to track and maintain your interest and know.
I think there's a little bit of a challenge and a tension that we feel, and if the board wants to give additional direction, we're certainly welcome to take that. I think what happened in the first iteration of the CIP is that it followed the master plan very, very specifically, and it made this identification, certainly not by any error of staff or anyone's judgment, but then, of course, when you do get into this deeper dive of the assessments and the alignment feasibility, assessments and all of the other studies that you have to do, it became clear that we ran into a situation where all of a sudden you realize that there was a delay that was forced upon a particular project. And how do you deal, knowing that that is going to happen, perhaps not uncommonly or infrequently? How do you communicate to the public in a way that isn't confusing or unintentionally misleading? So that is how the CIP has gravitated towards more of a category-based and not project-based, because we don't want to raise expectations unnecessarily, and it's only natural, as we've all seen, for there to be a misinterpretation that when you see a particular area named, that is an absolute irrevocable commitment or ability even to move forward with that project. And actually it's less an issue of, we're committed to all of it, but it's really a question of viability and ability and financing and a lot of other issues.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense to me. And we're not gonna fund one $20 million stormwater management project if we have 6 smaller projects that you could achieve with the same amount of money. I think that the question just becomes, the old system was, as you were saying, unintentionally misleading. It did, however, have the elegance of people being able to do a find for my neighborhood in the CIP. And so I think what you're hearing me itching for is some way that we can keep information flowing as it moves through a process that is more complex than our old way of doing things actually, gave fair representation to.
We did, briefly, we did have a discussion in a meeting this morning where we identified a package of other measures that residents can undertake themselves. That's not to say it's all your responsibility, but a package in terms of sharing knowledge. Also, for lack of a better description, a white paper that will really cover the dynamic nature of the CIP and why that's so. Clearly, an invitation to greater community engagement so we can be very clear and not, again, inadvertently miscommunicate or misdirect expectations. And also where a project looks like it could cost tens of millions of dollars, that's what these new feasibility studies, that's that new category, because it's really looking at, okay, that was the conventional approach, but is there a new approach, or are there other options that mitigate the risk sufficiently for the residents and that can be undertaken as part of a suite of remedies or actions, including the actions by the citizens themselves, where we can grant relief at a more economic rather than just crossing it off because of the conventional price tag?
Ms. Garvey, did you want?
Yeah, I think just pursuing the same conversation we're having, this is really helpful. So what you're describing to me, in a way, is a system of triage. You're sort of, what we can do quickly and easily, what we can do, trying to put them into different categories. And I just want to say, so there are 107 hotspots, and then you said 20 to 30 target areas. And I'm sorry, is there an overlap there?
Sorry, that was my miscommunication. There were 107 areas identified in the master plan where, for example, there were under capacity or antiquated or over time failing, infrastructure.
Okay, thank you.
And the hotspots are the 20 to 30 hotspots.
And those are the ones that are particularly bad in these rain events? Is that what makes it a hotspot? What makes it a hotspot? I should know, but I'm sorry.
It's a combination of, and this past year was a good example of it, where again, you just had, not to be glib, this was truly the perfect storm, where you had repeated, sustained, intense, and rain events of long duration. And what happened with this just kind of repetitive event like this over and over again is that your ground just saturated very quickly. It had no more capacity for the water to perk. It started gathering, and also this, in the earlier workshop that we did, where we said there are a number of streams that have been undergrounded, and that exacerbates the problem. So that is really the critical. So we looked at historical events. Obviously, this past year will become, or already is now, in one of those historical events.
Thank you. And the 20 to 30 hotspots, have you completed the feasibility studies how far are you on the feasibility studies, getting them done for each? I assume that's what you need to do, is look at what it looks like is needed, because that gives you the cost and the how many barriers you have. And that's not yet completed for all of these? I see not yet.
No, it's a time-consuming process, and it's a not inexpensive one as well.
I think this really is a community engagement, getting the information out. So I think we're absolutely on the right track, where it really will be clear, as Ms. Crystal's questioning was sort of saying. It was so nice when people could just look at, what's my address, where am I on the queue, what's going on. So the sooner we can kind of get to that, the better. But of course, people are going to need this overlay of information. And I assume if you've got one project that's $20 million and maybe would take care of 20 homes, and then you've got a whole bunch of other little projects that would take care of 220 homes, we're probably going to go to the 220. I mean, that's part of how we will probably do the triage, and that probably needs to be made clear to people when you kind of figure out what all the different triage is. I really like the idea of getting together some information out to people, what you can do now. I also think it seems to me, as we're sort of all aware, we're entering a different time in the climate, and these rain events so you didn't have a system that was really that prepared for something that happened every 50 years, but suddenly they're happening every 10 years, maybe every 5 years, and it's a very, very different thing, and we can't instantly turn on a dime to get those things done. And that's another explanation that needs to be made to people. And I think the more the people understand what their expectations should be, and the more they understand what they can do to mitigate it now, to help them get through until they actually, we do it the right way and get it all done, because it may be quite a wait, just simply because it's just not possible to do it all at once the way we'd like to. So I think we're really on the right track. Mr. Manager?
I was going to ask, actually, and I don't know the answer to the question, but it might be helpful for people, because when we did the slide presentation on this, we had talked about, I think there was about $450,000 or $460,000 for design work, and then we talk about capacity for doing feasibility and scope analyses. For us to give a sense to the people who are listening, how many of these feasibility analyses on these hotspots we have done, and how long it would take us to get it done at what rate, so that people can get a sense.
That's great.
And you don't need to answer that right now, but I think that would be very helpful for people to understand, not so much when the project's going to happen, but when it is that we're going to get the assessment of whether it's doable,
right,
and economical.
I think each project is probably unique, so it goes on a case, by case basis. But because I've been here 3 months and Jason has been here for a much longer time along with Liz, I think I'm going to defer to him or both of them on the historical context.
Sure.
Sure, thanks, Demetra. Jason Papakosma in Office of Stormwater, Sustainability and Environmental Management. Today it's stormwater, right? Well, just to build on that response, so in terms of delivering the capital program, we have project management and engineering resources internally paid for the stormwater fund. So there's a delivery capacity that's fixed by those resources. And right now, when it comes to these particular issues, we're scoping, we're kind of laying out the schedule for, okay, given the engineers we have, the project management staff we have, how many of these feasibility studies can we accomplish and over what time frame? We're working on that for Waverly Hills, for example, laying out the time frame, and some of the other higher priority projects as well. And I wanted to add that the June 2006 storm that we had was unique because it was our flood of record and it hit the county in its entirety. These other events more recently have been very intense where they've hit, but they've been very localized. So what the June 2006 event did is it gave us, in an unfortunate way, the list of priorities.
All the way around.
Because of flooding complaints that we received. These 4 homes here, these 6 homes there. So we built on that when we did some of our modeling and assessment to really refine, well, where's the capacity the most strained and where are our priorities from there? So the 20 to 30 high priority sites emerge first from that actual event and then from an additional modeling exercise that followed.
This is really helpful. I think down that we maybe want to do, I don't know if it's a work session or something, you guys finish up, because I think the more people, I'm sorry, Mr. Manager, some way.
We are doing a work session on stormwater.
That's right, we are.
Those with a slightly different focus, but
It'll be an opportunity
perhaps
to
we can
revisit
make it an
some
entire day.
Visit, yeah.
Retreat on stormwater.
A retreat on stormwater manager. All I'm looking, I think you got to put yourself in the mind of the homeowner and what they want to know, and as much as we can get that information to them, and it's just a whole lot harder and more complex than it would seem. Everybody assumes this is a county that works really well. We have really good government, we have really good services, and of course our plumbing works and our sewer system works. But actually, with these kind of rain events and where we are, it's not working so well, and it's to be expected if you really understand what's going on. And I think we just need to get that information out in a way people can digest.
At it from a perspective of a homeowner, I think if I'm listening to this, well, I'm probably frustrated because I thought there was some money identified earlier, but I want to know right now, if I'm in these 27 or 30 areas, when is it that Jason's going to knock on my front door with the results of the feasibility analysis? Is it going to be tomorrow or next week? And I think what we're saying is it won't be tomorrow or next week, but we need to give people a sense of when it will be and what the cost is associated and how many of those we're actually going to deliver.
Right. And then maybe a nice handy information about, meanwhile, these are some things you can do now to protect your home and yourself. Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Gutschall.
That's actually a perfect segue into what I wanted to address, which is specifically how we're going to get information out. Because of everything that I've heard and learned today, the only thing that I want to make sure of is that we do this in a very equitable fashion, because there are these 29 or so, whatever they are, high or medium priority projects listed in our stormwater master plan. And I think that a couple of things that I learned today is, one, that which of those hot spots, if you will, is impacted is highly dependent on very, microclimate events. These are, rainfall events that aren't across the whole county. There's something that happened in a very specific watershed. And so who gets kind of hit next or before is very, it's very hard to predict that. And so I don't think that my ask here is that we not wait for something to happen to a neighborhood for them to come out and ask for where this is, that we need to be proactive in reaching out to all 29 or whatever the cutoff point is, but giving everyone equal access. Because I don't want, since we have limited funds and we have to target these funds in a way that is the most effective use of them, I don't want this to be a case of who, the squeaky wheel, right? Like who comes up and who has the most time to come out and advocate and consistently email and follow up and keep on it. I think that we ought to approach this with the eye that all of the neighborhoods on that list are an equal play, regardless of their connectedness, shall we say, to county government and access to that. So that's point number one. And then the other point is I just wanted to make sure I understood correctly from the staff response that we got about changes in the funding projections, where the manager has written to us that these funds are funded out of the sanitary district tax, right? And that's in total or that's in part?
In total.
In total.
Yes.
So if we wanted to come up with more money for this program, most likely we would look at increasing that tax rate potentially in order to find more money.
Yeah, when it was adopted in 2009, it was at 1 cent on the tax rate. Then it was increased to 1.3 cents a couple of years later, and it's been at that level for, I think, the last 8 years. That is the lever that you would use to adjust it.
Right. But then the money for this program has kind of fluctuated a little bit from FY13 CIP from 43.3 million. It went up a little bit for FY15 to 24, then down again for FY17 to 26, and now down a little bit in this proposed CIP. What causes that fluctuation up and down?
Well, I think to some extent, we talked about the evolution of how the CIP is done. I think I can speak to more recently. The funding you see is based on the funding we can count on, based on revenue projections. In the past, I think it was a little more of a combination of funding needs that may or may not have been provided at that time with the sanitary tax rate, but would be expected to be provided during the cycle. But we've shifted to a little more strict interpretation of it's based on your estimate of current revenues projected over time. What would you expect to have over the 10 years?
Sure. Okay. So we have the money that we have, and my whole point here is that we keep a strong eye towards equity, equal access to this funds based, and make sure that money is directed towards the best projects, right? The ones that yield the most gain for the dollars invested through the criteria that's already set up in that. Those criteria are in the stormwater master plan.
They're in the stormwater master plan, but in addition to that, we're also going to be conducting in this particular 2-year iteration of the CIP a more granular risk assessment, an asset inventory and risk assessment plan that will go through and really do a far greater and deeper dive on ranking and grading the vulnerability and the impact. And when you do risk management assessments, of course, the probability of occurrence, and if something occurs, the magnitude of the impact. That is going to identify with greater specificity high priority and key vulnerable areas out of this 20 to 30. So the process will be driven by the vulnerability and the risk elements, and not by location, or as you said, it'll be agnostic. We are looking, obviously, to maintain social equity in the program. So this assessment is going to be ongoing, and at the same time, clearly in all the discussions that we've had, we really realize that maybe it takes a village in this case. So we're looking to the public to work with us and be actors working towards the community benefit, but it really is relying on us to give out that information, develop that package. And like you said, we have these 20 to 30 key spots that are identified. We're going to be reaching out to the civic associations, to the libraries, to social media, et cetera, and to direct engagement with those communities, hopefully to be a little bit more bi-directional and to communicate more openly and in a way that the public can understand and rely on in terms of the CIP plan and what that means.
Sure, thank you. And so, Madam Chair, I think I would, consistent with what I heard others of my colleagues here express, this idea of kind of the outreach and how we're communicating all of this conversation to the interested individuals, and frankly to the individuals who don't know that they should be interested, which is the other key part of it. Is it possible perhaps that we could have ask for some guidance, some draft guidance this week that would be ready for us by Saturday around communication and civic engagement, whether it's some kind of white paper executive summary that goes out or just whatever. I think you guys have it. I think you understand. It's just putting it in a little bit of guidance for us.
The expectation.
Exactly.
Right, and so to be clear, you're asking not for that white paper by Saturday, but for a paragraph of draft guidance to task staff via the county manager with the development of that outreach.
Oh, I think staff's ready to provide it by Saturday, right? You're writing it right now, exactly.
But I would,
correct, Madam Chair.
I would like to note that, and I encourage people, and you can tell them what keyword, to go on our website, and there are a few pieces of information there right now that talk about materials that FEMA has put together, and also the opportunity for people to buy flood insurance, especially if you're not in a FEMA flood zone. Those are opportunities that people shouldn't wait on until the white paper is prepared.
Good point, Mr. Manager. But yes, your first point about just guidance for us this Saturday, that just would be the precursor to the.
I'll work with the manager to have that. Let me, Mr. Vice, if you'll indulge me, let me just ask one question. This is I think, as Mr. Gutschall just indicated, I think that really is the takeaway. I think anything else we'd be giving guidance would basically be tasking you to do what you're already doing. So I don't know that we need to go a whole lot further, with one exception that I just want to clarify my own understanding of. This money, as the manager, one of my colleagues was alluding, this CIP includes money for feasibility studies.
Yes.
And is that anticipated to be spent in the first 2 years of this CIP, such that at the time of adoption of the next CIP, we will have feasibility studies on projects, and assuming sufficient funding, right, we'll actually be able to include in the CIP specific projects designed for those 20 to 30 hotspots. Is that assumption correct?
Not all 20 to 30, because we don't, I'm sorry.
Great point.
Yeah.
But we will be able to say, here are 2 or 3 projects that will be advancing where we have done this analysis, we have done the comparative work, and we'll be able to, in some ways, get back to almost where we were 2 or 3 CIPs ago, except it'll be concrete and substantiated this time. Yeah. Okay, so I don't think we need to include guidance to that effect, because again, that's what you're doing anyway, but I think an important thing for us to know. Mr. Weisstadt on this topic.
Sure. Thanks. So, Mr. Gutschall and others have focused on funding mechanisms, and we've talked a lot about hotspots and specific locations that are focal points for attention. I want to take the conversation up a level, and also just elicit staff response to a couple questions I had in the context of the CIP about a week ago, which have now come back, and I really appreciate these answers. So. One question has been, what are we doing in terms of maintaining the existing storm drains and ensuring that they're cleansed and serviced properly and so forth? And I don't know, Mr. Papakosma, if you want to just reiterate the, the fact that we use TV camera inspections and catch basins and that type of thing, and that DES, water and sewer and streets crews respond immediately to overflows. Would you like to just expand on that at all?
Sure, yeah, that is correct. We have, I'd say the first piece is we have crews available that are 24 hours a day to deal with anything that's reported, urgent situations. The storm sewer inspection and catch basin inspection programs aren't intended to be preventative on a 3 or 6 month, let's check the catch basins. It's just, that would be too resource intensive. There are, for example, 10,000 catch basins alone. But they're more intended to address are there systemic areas that might, catch debris more frequently or not? But more importantly, they're also assessing the condition of the infrastructure to then program on the infrastructure reinvestment side of the CIP. Where do we need to replace pipes that are deteriorating because of either age or the condition itself?
Okay. And then you also indicated, you talked about development activity, and you said that the Stormwater Wise landscape program provides a cost-sharing incentive to reduce stormwater runoff for residential and commercial properties through pervious paving, pavement removal, rain gardens, and conservation landscaping. So this is something where we're basically empowering and partnering with our citizens to do more on their own. And you say the program is funded for approximately 40 residential and 10 HOA/commercial participants each year. Do you believe that this is meeting demand? And just what's your kind of, takeaway assessment at this moment about that program? And do you have suggestions for adjusting it in the future?
I would say that to date, the demand is at or exceeding our ability to supply it. We have a process every year where people can apply, and we're never short on potential participants in that process. So there's still interest in the community for this cost sharing mechanism. It has a connection in a couple places. So our stormwater permit that's issued by the state. One of the emphases of that permit is to deal with stormwater pollution in as many ways as you can from all possible sources. So what you've tended to see over the years is these types of programs are actually required by the permit. So DC has programs like this, Montgomery County, we have them. It's one of multiple sources of stormwater. There's existing properties, there's properties that redevelop, there's our own roadways and streetscape systems. So we're trying to deal with all the sources of stormwater. It's not going to be fixed in 5 years, but it's a way over time to start building that momentum. And also it's an educational piece as well. And we actually fix a lot of existing drainage problems as part of this program as well.
Okay, that's great to hear. Is this, can this be plotted, or have you plotted this through the GIS system as to where this is taking place in the various neighborhoods that would be accessible to folks?
Yes, it's definitely, we have plotted it. I'm going to turn to Kristen. Do we have it on the website yet? Okay. But we could certainly do that.
I think that would really be helpful from an educational perspective. And then I just want to call attention to your other responsive answer, which I really appreciate, in terms of, you referenced a statistic a few weeks ago regarding impervious surfaces being on the upward trend from an estimate of 40% in 2001 to 45% with the 2017 update. And you talked about regulated development activity adding an average of nearly 9 acres per year over this time period. I don't know if you have that excerpt. For reference, this pace is the equivalent of adding the footprint of the Pentagon, 29 acres every 3 to 4 years, and then single-family home redevelopment is actually the largest single source of impervious surface increase, representing nearly 60% over the time period, and at the pace adding to our footprint of the Pentagon every 5 to 6 years. So, I do think that this illustrates our ever vigilant need to do more to strengthen and enhance our tree canopy. And certainly, I think we would all welcome other thoughts and initiatives as to how we can help mitigate the increasing, imperviosity of so many of our surfaces as Arlington continues to grow. It's a challenge. Thank you.
That is the subject of conversation for our upcoming stormwater work session. So more to come on that one. Thank you. I think we've probably, for now, exhausted the topic. Really appreciate your coming back and engaging with us for a second time as we seek to communicate out the hard work that you all have been doing. So we'll look in for and iterate with you all on the right guidance about the public-facing communications that we can adopt on Saturday. But I don't think that requires resolution today because it won't have implications on where the funding dollars are going. So we have a few days to work with you on it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Colleagues, other topics or proposals for guidance? I have just one more to raise, which is the question of parkland acquisition. So, Mr. Manager, you had shared with us a proposal to bundle differently and in some cases increase parkland acquisition dollars. I've shared it with our clerk, who can pull it up on the screen. And I think this is something the board might be interested in adopting, although with Ms. Garvey's good point in mind about maybe keeping it more broad to land acquisition where possible. I think maybe it would probably be most helpful to ask you or Ms. Grendel to just walk us through a little bit about some of the shifts here. And for context, I know one of the areas that has been causing board members concern during the CIP conversation is knowing we are about to adopt a public spaces master plan update that calls for acquisition of parkland in order to meet our targets for levels of service and community needs. We are feeling some concern that our CIP that we're about to adopt might be out of step with those goals later in the year. So I think our Department of Parks and Recreation staff and County Manager's Office have put their heads together on thinking about how we might address that problem. So that's the preface and context, and I'll turn it to the manager, Ms. Grendel, whomever would like to walk us through this.
Sure. So typically in previous CIPs, we've had about $15 million across the 10-year period. So with that in mind, we looked at this CIP, re-looked at it. We have $3.5 million that shows right now in the manager's proposed budget, and that's using existing funds. So we were able to identify about another $14.5 million. Trying to also find funds that could be spread across the 10-year period of time. So in the earlier part of the years in 19 and 21, one proposal that we had was to take funding for synthetic fields, which APS has actually included in their adopted budget for the
CIP.
The CIP budget, right, for the conversion for TJ and also for Kenmore. And one of the things is we've had a lot of discussion with them about cost sharing in that first upfront development cost. So I think that's a good positive thing. But in our CIP, we had reflected as if we were fully funding it. And so now that we know where they are, that frees up about $625,000 in FY19 and about 1.345 in 21 that could be now moved from one park category to another to fund land acquisition. The second thing that we'd proposed in 21 is something that you were talking about earlier for NC, and that was the potential to consider that $1 million from the DHS project.
I just wanted to pause there for a second. It shows up as fiscal 21 here, but we actually, the money is freed up earlier than that. This we just showed it being spent in 21. So those of you keeping score at home for neighborhood conservation, that $1 million would show up in fiscal year 19 and 20.
Okay.
Okay. For 23, this is just acknowledgement of something that I think the managers indicated to the board previously, which is we have the option for the WETA site down there at Jenny Dean. There is $8 million in funds previously allocated from prior year bond premiums, and so this would be about the timing of when we would be buying that, but those monies are already reserved, so we wanted to reflect those. And then in the out years, in 25 and 27, what we had suggested is taking the Shirlington Park project, which is something that the board just adopted the framework plan for the 4MRV, and we're coming forward in September with the master plan, and dividing that Shirlington Park project into two, so taking half of the design money in 25 and half of the design money in 27 towards land acquisition, and then making the second phase of Shirlington Park out beyond the 10-year CIP timeframe. But it is a project, it's a very long linear park that we could focus on entryways and some of those improvements, and then come back, for example, and do some of the boardwalks and the overlooks and things.
And so I'm sorry, how much so that would reallocate how much from Shirlington Park to land acquisition?
That would give $1 million from the design money in 25 and about 2.53 in 2027. So again, across the whole stretch, that gives about 14.5 of additional funding from what was in the manager's proposed CIP.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Grindle. It's helpful to be walked through it and helpful to understand where it might be coming from. Questions or comments about what's this idea that has been proposed, reactions to it? I think, again, similar to our conversation previously, we don't need to vote to approve this, but if we would like to head in this direction that Ms. Grindle just outlined, it would be helpful for the manager's office and DMF to know that so they can bring us a slightly reworked CIP on Saturday. So any reactions to it one way or another?
Generally favorable, Madam Chair. I'll just, my role is to be a downer today. As we look at the upcoming 30 acres of parkland that we're going to, or open space that we're desiring to acquire at current values, that's about $4.5 million an acre. Doesn't all have to come from cash. It could come from donations. It could come from developer contributions, et cetera, but this is not going to get us there, and people should just recognize that we are taking gestures as appropriate, but we're going to have some fundamental shifts if we're going to realize our ultimate long-term goals.
Well taken.
So
Ms.
I'll be a
Garvey?
broken record and just say, I'm much more comfortable putting it in land acquisition, not saying it has to be parks, whatever, I'm fine using it with parks, but it gives us the flexibility because with schools needs and who knows whatever needs, I just don't like to have my hands tied that much if I can avoid it.
Sure. So can you say a little more about what that would mean for this proposal? The
So I'm
near years are turf conversion estimates. So would you want those turf conversion estimates to be allocated to land acquisition rather than parkland acquisition?
Yeah, and I'm not even totally set on that, but that makes sense. But I would be much more comfortable in land acquisition rather than parks acquisition, again, to preserve the flexibility for whatever we need. We're kind of scraping things here to find extra funds for what we need. And I don't think we know right now. We've just got a lot going on, and it might not be a park, or it might be. So
Sure. So
yeah.
let me actually ask the manager in terms of what that would mean. Would we need to change the bond referenda language to do what Ms. Garvey's asking?
I think the source of the synthetic turf funding that is being suggested that it be moved is PAYGO and I think short-term financing. So there isn't anything that you have to do on Saturday in order to memorialize that guidance. If you want to have, if Lisa or Michelle have something to add.
I'm not sure. I don't have my CIP in front of me, but I think that actually the conversion money may be bond funded or short-term financing. It's not PAYGO. Is
Financing,
it
it's not
short-term?
PAYGO,
Okay.
it's not referenda authority.
It's not referenda.
Right.
Okay.
So we can get back to you on the specifics of how that would work with the short-term financing, but it doesn't implicate any of the general obligation bonds.
And the $8 million for the WETA site in 2023 is outside the bond referendum anyway, and actually that money is parkland acquisition money, so we probably.
Yeah, that money came from bond premium, so that again could be used for, we have it dedicated for this, so that's.
And then we can have a conversation in 2025 and 2027, Ms. Garvey, that is more consistent with your point, but
I
really,
look forward to that conversation, Ms. Crystal.
Really appreciate your point, and I just wanted to probe a little bit to make sure we weren't locking ourselves into anything that would preclude the sort of flexibility for which you're asking. Mr. Gutschall.
I will associate myself with both Ms. Garvey and Mr. Dorsey, meaning that I think we have to face the reality of that we are not able at this time to fund all of the land acquisition that we might like to. I will, however, and I know this is not news to anyone here, but land is not going to get cheaper as we move into the future. So we have to do what we can right now, and we will have to be looking at, if we're going to be serious about the goals of our public spaces master plan, looking at how we're going to achieve that. That's, I think, a conversation for another time. But I will also like to just double down and bring back up, and I don't know if it's something, if my colleagues would entertain it, is to have the option, that $1 million, if we could have preserved right now, the option for Saturday of either NCAC or land acquisition. I would prefer that, but again, I'm not going to fall on my sword over that. So if others are amenable, that would be my ask at this point.
Sure. And so to just engage in a bit of sausage making for anybody who's following along with us, let me look to the manager and ask, in terms of preparing materials for Saturday, is it possible to have two versions of the or to advance, of course, the manager's recommendation would be, whatever amendments, or if you could prepare for us two amendments to the bond referenda language, one which would redirect that $1 million to local parks and recreation referenda question, and one that would redirect it to community. Sorry, what is the neighborhood conservation falls under community conservation or community infrastructure, so that we have those options.
But we can do that. I think that's a relatively straightforward, just transposition of numbers, and I think that our staff will check, but the debt service implications of that are so minimal that we don't have to really worry about how that affects the ratios, depending on when the spend out is. So we will present the alternate numbers for you.
That would be great. So, Mr. Gutschall, we will have that option, and whether we introduce one as a motion and one as a substitute motion, we'll work through. But definitely appreciate that spirit of flexibility, and thank you to the manager's team for giving us the paperwork that will enable that conversation. And we might want to hear from community members in the meantime. So we would invite that feedback to the extent folks have a priority for that money courtesy of the state's investment. Mr. Vice-Stat.
Yeah. So I said a little earlier that a number of days ago that one of the more disappointing features of this CIP is the dwindling dollars for land acquisition, and so this may well be one modest way of adjusting that balance. And I appreciate Ms. Garvey's comment about the need for flexibility. As we all know, we're not making any more land. It's not getting any cheaper. You know, at the same time, it's also a little frustrating that we have gone to, you know, we are going to be in the context of the land swap with Virginia Hospital Center acquiring the Carlin Springs Road site and we've already, of course, funded the Buck property, and yet we don't have enough planning money to really decide, at least in the near term, what we're going to be doing with that site on Carlin Springs. So I'm just musing a little bit that, you know, we're going to be banking land, but, you know, at some point we're going to have to decide, you know, how are we going to plan it, or if we're going to plan it, if we're going to leave it open space, and there's certainly something to be said for that depending on where the land is and what the land is, or are we going to be using it for community needs of whatever purpose, ranging from, you know, fields and parks to structures of some sort. Thanks.
Sure. I think, Mr. Rice, I very much agree. I think disappointment maybe is the name of the game in the CIP update for all of the constraints, the reasons of the constraints we've reflected throughout. And we'll have an opportunity for further comments on Saturday. For now, I think we are set to wrap up. I will thank our staff members who've joined us, as well as the county manager and his team and the Department of Management and Finance. Mr. Manager, any closing thoughts you wanted to make today?
No, except to point out to people who we will have the actual board report that reflects the potential changes. I think our goal is to have that out, today's Tuesday, by Thursday, for people to look at, because I want to make sure their opportunity. And I think you have said there's more flexibility here than there is in the operating budget, so that's not to foreclose the absolutely, it's certain to happen, a brilliant idea from a county board member to come on Saturday.
Excellent. And the board report will also reflect the school board's adopted CIP to reflect all the changes there, because that, of course, you know, with the publication dates is different. So just remember that. You'll see red lines of that for schools.
That's a great point, Ms. Cowan. And actually, I just wanted to note, you know, we've seen the draft, and it's been in the, I think, of the board report, for Arlington Public Schools bond referendum question. And colleagues, it's worth reminding ourselves we have the ability to vote yay or nay on that. We do not have the ability to line item edit it. However, I just wanted to commend Ms. Cowan and the school's finance team for working on, I had one change within the explanation to make it much clearer. Right now it reads the Career Center project, the following bonds expected to fund the following projects. The Career Center project to include an 800-seat performing arts facility and field and parking garage. I think it really behooves all of us to be incredibly explicit that this project, that money rather, does not fund that project. It funds the design and planning for that project. I know it's been a source of concern in the community that somehow the CIP moves forward with that project with a lot of questions about it still unresolved. So really thank schools for being willing to adjust that language, and it sounds like we can expect to see adjusted language. Mr. Dorsey, did you have a thought?
I was just going to ask process-wise, Madam Chair, on Saturday, to what extent are we going to have anyone from APS available for any questions or conversation, or are those responsibilities going to be handled by our staff, Mr. Schwartz?
As of right now, I hadn't intended to have anyone from schools available, but if that's the board's pleasure, I'd be more than happy to reach out to the superintendent and have someone here to answer any questions that you might have.
I wouldn't say it's my pleasure. I'm just trying to anticipate a future need. That's all. That's all. I wouldn't make a specific request on my part because I think I'm good and comfortable. I'm just...
Given that the range of options before us are so limited, it's really just an up or down vote on their bond referendum question. I think we could probably let them have their Saturday.
And they'll tell us to vote yes.
Yes, exactly. So. Exactly. But nearly every project that's included in their bond question, whether it's the Career Center Arlington Tech, the Career Center Long-Term Future, Reed Site, Education Center, we're going to have continued conversations with them, I think, on materializing those projects.
Yeah, I would just say in the future, and I don't really quite know, the thought just literally came to me, but given, you know, that they are, you know, the biggest line item in our CIP, well above, you know, nationally, local spending accounts for, about 40% of school budgets. Ours, it's substantially higher. We don't get very much state money. It's a big deal in Arlington, what we spend on schools, which I'm fully supportive of, but I think we ought to maybe give it the due attention that it requires since it's so substantial.
Absolutely, and I'll flag that too for further process improvements. I've sort of bemoaned throughout that because our CIPs are a little off schedule from one another, we meet when they've already done some thinking prior to a lot of our analysis, and then we're sort of iterating along the way, and they're a few steps ahead of us. It's really hard for us to compare. So that's a challenge we might recommit ourselves to resolving in the update 2 years from now. Good point. All right, so seeing no further comments with regard to our final work session, and sometimes inelegant markup, but appreciate staff's help in bearing with us, I'm going to move us into a closed session. I move that the county board convene a closed meeting as authorized by Virginia Code Section 2.23711A8 for the purpose of discussing one matter requiring consultation with the county attorney and necessary staff concerning the comprehensive plan land use designations and zoning district requirements applicable to the use of property by the county for public purposes and the procedures and substantive considerations applicable to changes by the board in those land use designations, the zoning districts, and the district.
Second.
Okay, that motion's been moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, we move into closed.